good evening to all of you, and thanks for joining my inaugural lecture this evening. So I'll just say a few words. Actually, Richard has covered a lot of it, just really to give a bit of context at how I've arrived at the work that I'm doing now. And as Richard said, my work's always been underpinned by interest in social justice, inclusion, and citizenship. I've just put up here some of the publications that Richard has mentioned of the work that relates to it. So on the far left, Education for Inclusive Citizenship, this was really at the start of my academic journey and was the basis of my PhD research, where I looked at citizenship education as it was made a statutory or required subject in the curriculums in schools in England. And my particular interest was how policymakers and curriculum developers actually understood the concept of citizenship. So I interviewed a range of stakeholders, including David Blunkett and his advisor at the time, Sir Bernard Crick, the late Sir Bernard Crick. And it was really off the back of that experience that I was then invited to be involved in the Home Office work, because David Blunkett was the Secretary of State for Education at the time, and then he moved across to the Home Office. And so there were threads running through from that policy work in education with the naturalisation work. And the requirements that we finally recommended for people who were to become British citizens were framed in a particularly educative way. It wasn't just the test, but it was the idea that it wouldn't be a barrier and that people would take courses, English language courses with embedded content, so that it would just be to show progress and really having access to an educational experience. And so the second book, it was based on it's an edited book that was based on examples across many country contexts. We held a conference, so there are chapters there from Ukraine, actually, it'll be interesting to look back on, and comparative across Europe and also Lebanon as well. The third image there, Life in the United Kingdom, A Journey to Citizenship. This was the first publication that I was involved with the Home Office, and that's what the UK citizenship test is based on. So people have to read that and become familiar with that material. And then the final one is the UNESCO publication that Richard mentioned. This is a publication that I co-authored and was launched in South Korea in 2015, and has been used by many states. You know, with UNESCO and the relationship with member states, it's not a requirement. It's always, you know, optional for member states, but many member states have opted in and used this as a kind of template for thinking about global citizenship. So after that work, my work shifted to a focus on the Middle East, which was in part because I got a job at the American University of Beirut in 2012. And my work was still underpinned by my interest in social justice, inclusion, and citizenship, but it was a very different sociological and political context. It was at the time really at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, and that had a massive effect on Lebanon. Lebanon is a small country. There are actually more Lebanese living outside of the country than actually within the country. At the time I was there, it was about 4.5 million. And in addition to that, 500,000 Palestinian refugees already there. And then there was an influx of approximately 1.5 million Syrian refugees. So when we hear in Europe, you know, that we're being flooded by refugees, and it's literally in the hundreds or thousands, this gives an idea. You know, in Lebanon and also Turkey were the countries in the region that had the highest number of Syrian refugees from that point and till now. What's also a key feature is that the majority of refugees were women and children, and also high numbers of disabled people as well. And I use the word refugee not in the legal sense, because Lebanon isn't actually a signatory to the UN Convention for Refugees. So their situation is even more precarious in that they don't have any kind of legal status at all. They're quite invisible, and that's a kind of compounded vulnerability. This is just to illustrate visually some of the points that Richard has made about the Disability Under Siege programme. So this is an externally funded research programme that's being run over 4 years. We're about the halfway point now. So it was started in 2020. It's going through till 2024. And it's called the Global Challenges Research Fund Network Plus programme. And it's funded through the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And what's quite distinctive about the Network Plus programme is that it's not just going out and conducting a discrete research project and collecting the data, but rather it's taking a broad survey, and it's a co-created programme where in the first phase we worked together with all the partners and all the networks within the region, and had consultation with those broader networks to identify what the priorities are, where the gaps in research are. And that's the stage that we're at now, is that we've commissioned some smaller scale research projects, network projects. We're in the process of advertising for postdoctoral fellows and also larger grants. That call has just been launched. So as you can see, there's a cluster of co-Is actually here at the University of Birmingham across different departments and colleges within the university. Birmingham City University, then we have Birzeit University in Palestine, the Islamic University of Gaza, the Center for Lebanese Studies at the Lebanese American University, and then the non-academic partners include IDRAC, which is an initiative that focuses on online learning that's part of the Queen Rania Foundation, Al-Ma'mal Institution in Jerusalem of Arts, Action on Armed Violence, and the Catan Foundation, an arts institution with offices in London as well as in Palestine. And as you can see, these are the three areas that we're working in: Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. Just presented that visually on the map. So, what are we doing? The overall objective is to provide the intellectual, financial, and logistical resources that are needed by local practitioners to deliver a transformational step change in educational provision for children with disabilities in conflict-affected states. So this will be fundamental to challenging the status quo that currently results in the majority of children with disabilities never attending school, and significantly improving education provision for those who are receiving education. So why is it needed? Well, there are some key statistics here that really are quite startling. 15% of the world's population, that's 1 billion people, experience some form of disability, and the prevalence is even higher in lower and middle income countries. And this is exacerbated by poverty and conflict, and it's gendered as well. And if we're looking to the future and future projections, this is a projection by the UN that's up to 1/4 of the world's population will have disabilities by 2050. And that's exacerbated particularly in lower and middle income countries because of conflict, crisis, poverty, and global climate change. Yet this link between conflict, disability, and access to education has been relatively under-examined in research. Yet we know in the region, over 85% of children with disabilities have never attended school. It's not that they've dropped out, they've never attended in the first place. And a broader aspect of this, if we look at who's doing the research, most of the research on disability is done in the global north, in the higher income economies, even though most people with disabilities are in the global south. So this is what's referred to when we use the term decolonisation of knowledge. This is really needed because most of the people with disabilities are not actually in the global north. So why are we looking at this in the Middle East? Well, partly it's because I was based there and I've built my networks up there and we have partners. But there are a number of aspects to it in terms of, from a research perspective that make it particularly interesting to look at. Firstly, there's significant underreporting of disability. In part, this is due to societal stigma. It's highly stigmatized we see that globally, but it's especially highly stigmatized in the Middle East. And there's also significant underreporting because there are different measures, but also due to the dominance of what we call medical models of disability. When we say medical models, that refers to disability being thought of in terms of a disorder or a problem within the person, as opposed to what's called the social model, which is where it's understood in terms of barriers within one's environment. There are high rates of conflict-related disability in all three locations. So this is a really quite different aspect to when you look at global north, many global north contexts. And the refugee flows from the wider region, particularly Syria and Iraq, create an additional burden. And in a sense, it's a further axis of exclusion. As in many lower and middle income countries, the region has a very large youth population. And if we look at some statistics from a report of Human Rights Watch, in the region, it was estimated, and of course these estimates, you will find different estimates because people use different kinds of measures. But this one estimate had this startling number of 95% of children with disabilities are excluded from primary school. But on the other hand, there's a very vibrant civil society in these countries, and a lot of social activists, disability-led organizations. So a really effective but under-resourced network of local partners who, very much wanted to engage and have the opportunity to work in this way with this opportunity offered by the Network Plus. So how are we working? So this is a multifaceted challenge. It cuts across education, health. Our lives are not in one sector. So this is why we brought together an interdisciplinary group, and even the way we work and the methodologies that we use are interdisciplinary. And this is because when we're looking at education policy and practice and what gets prioritized and what resources there are, this is shaped by what public understandings there are, what the law looks like, health, religion, and culture. So we really need to work across all these different domains to address this multifaceted challenge. And in particular, I mean, we're funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It's been a fantastic opportunity for us to really look at the role of arts and humanities and how that has significant potential for constructing new contextualized public knowledge on disability, working through visual forms, narrative forms, so including film, fiction, autobiographies, cartoons, graffiti even. So we're also interested in street art, not just what you have in your public institution, your museums and galleries, but what's happening at the level of the street as well. Media, social media. So just to say a little bit about what does disability look like in the Middle East. So I already just mentioned previously about the concept of disability. And what we've seen globally is that there's been a shift from very sort of strict medical ways of understanding disability to a social model of disability. And this came about largely by disability activists in the 60s and 70s in the US and in the UK, really advocating for disability to be understood in terms of how the environment disables us, and the way the environment is designed is a disabling factor. That is not saying that, that there may not be a medical issue, but this is really a social and political point that it allows us to question, why are we organizing society in the way that we're organizing it when it excludes so many people, and this is going to increase. Now, when we look in the Middle East, though, and especially Palestine, this problematizes the boundaries of disability. Now, where you have so much widespread violence and lack of human rights, education under protracted Israeli occupation in refugee camps, it makes the teaching and learning environment unsafe for all Palestinian school children, and especially those with disabilities. Schools have also, been hit by airstrikes and students injured. And in both Palestine and Lebanon, because of the situation and refugees as well, schools actually run on shifts, sometimes not just 2 shifts, but triple shifts. So this is reduced hours of learning, and as a result of lack of basic resources. And many children are traumatized and just really living under chronic stress. So what does disabled mean in this kind of context? We also see, as we see everywhere, hierarchies of disability. And what's perhaps different in the Middle East context, in the context of war, those who are maimed or physically disabled as a result of violence are actually seen as heroic, and there will be more negative, stigmatizing views for those with congenital disability, that is, those born with a disability. So physical disabilities, blindness, deafness are less stigmatized, whereas those with intellectual disabilities or more profound and complex multiple disabilities will be the most stigmatized. What we also find in the region that perhaps Palestine is an exception. They've actually got some very good census data, but in general, there's a lack of reliable statistics and also demographical information on disability. And part of this is due to different measures, but also because of the widespread stigmatization as well. If we look to law, what we see is that, all 3 countries have national disability laws, and Jordan and Palestine have signed and ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Lebanon has signed it, but not yet ratified it. But I mean, so, you know, law is there, but we always know that we can see a gap between policy and law and practice. And then in terms of research, when we started to do our systematic review in the scoping phase at the beginning of the programme, what we found was that there's an almost complete lack of research on disability in the social sciences. What we saw is that most of the research is conducted in departments of medicine. So again, that shows that it's a dominant conceptualization that this is a medical problem. And there's some research in education departments, but typically in the form of kind of remedial measures that might be undertaken. But you know, whereas you can see research into other axes of inclusion, gender, refugees, race, religion, ethnicity, disability is not seen in that way at all as an issue of you know, lack of rights and social justice. So this is something that we're hoping, you know, that our project can highlight and help support. So if we look to education now and disability, it's estimated that there are far more disabled students than official estimates suggest, and this is even higher amongst refugee populations. As I've mentioned, significant gaps between policy and practice. Typically, schools struggle to implement, you know, government directives. Partly it's to do with physical accessibility. Approximately half of schools in Palestine are not physically accessible, and the majority of the public schools in Lebanon are not physically accessible. In fact, they did a survey in 2009, and they found only 5 out of 997 schools were physically accessible. And it's also an issue in Jordan as well. But across all three contexts, this issue of disability being stigmatized was deemed to be the greatest challenge to inclusion. Additional challenges include attitudes, teacher expertise, resources, lack of inclusive pedagogy, discriminatory curriculum and or lack of representation, transport costs, school supply costs, and costs of teaching assistants, which are borne by parents. Unlike schools here, if your child is deemed to have additional needs, then there may be, given the school resources, the possibility to have a teaching assistant if that's deemed needed. That's not the case in the region. The parents are required to pay for a teaching assistant if that child is to be allowed in the class, and if they can't afford it, then the school will take a position that that child can't be in the classroom. And in addition, there are intersectional challenges by social class, location, whether it's urban or rural, legal status, and gender. Now, as Richard mentioned, as part of our programme, and given the timing, you know, when we just started the programme, it was the start of the pandemic, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council approached us and said, would you do some work with the United Nations programme for the rights of persons with disabilities, because they're looking to support countries and lower and middle income countries in what's referred to as a disability inclusive recovery, cutting across all sectors. So we were funded for a year to work on this, and the idea was that it would be empirically based, this framework, because often the UN, different organizations create these frameworks, but often they have to be done at speed and there isn't time for it to be evidence informed. However, they had worked in the time so that our evidence could feed into this. And we conducted a wide-ranging, semi-systematic literature review covering the sectors of health, education, economy, and community. I mean, an estimated 80% of disabled people live in the global south, but it's difficult to assess the impact because the data is not often disaggregated by disability status. The only country that's published data on death rates from COVID so far is actually the United Kingdom. And here, 2/3 of people who died from COVID were disabled, 2/3. So that is a massively disproportionate number. And that's likely to be amplified even bigger in lower and middle income countries. So we identified 113 articles. Again, perhaps not surprisingly, most were in the health domain, and sadly, the fewest in education. Most research was conducted in the global north. I've just got a graph here on the right-hand side that just shows that visually. But yeah, so that's again showing the point that I made earlier about how the research is dominated from the global north. For this talk, I'm just going to talk about the findings that came out of the education sector. I won't cover health and community and economy today, but just to set as a kind of a baseline, only half of disabled children in low and middle income countries were in school before the pandemic. Now, with the pandemic, there were school closures in 188 countries, affecting 1.5 billion children. And this didn't only disrupt their learning, their education. This is an access and a lifeline to many other school functions, including food, hygiene, healthcare and therapy, safeguarding, and socializing. And then when it came to learning at home, disabled children faced barriers there too. Often either carers or parents would not be equipped or have the time. They would also be working to not be able to support them. But also there were issues around access to technology and the actual accessibility of technology, which were significant barriers. Now, I mean, things have stabilized and we're out of lockdown. But we still don't know, this is data to follow through. There's a risk of many not returning. And I mean, there's been data within the UK that's been published, but this will obviously be a huge issue in the global south, and especially for girls. What we did find when we did some reviews of previous pandemics, we found there weren't many studies, so there's not a lot of lesson learning from previous pandemics, but one of the findings was that there was a 65% increase in teenage pregnancies after Ebola. There's also the problem of attainment gaps and additional barriers at school. So, we flagged up the need for further work to look at data on school returns, also the tertiary sector, but also disabled parents and teachers. If we look across the review as a whole, 4 key themes emerged. Often we hear a rhetoric of disabled people have been forgotten or left behind. But what was really clear is that they were deprioritized, excluded, and discriminated against by governments. The medical model prevailed with a focus on vulnerability, with most articles on health and a focus on tragedy. And there's just a lack of data, both currently being collected and no baseline data. As I've mentioned already about the UK, with that statistic of 2/3 of COVID deaths are people with disabilities. We don't have that kind of data more broadly. And what's really critical is that it comes back again to this point of a multifaceted challenge and the importance of interdisciplinarity. These issues are interconnected. So food poverty spans economy, community, and health, for example, and there are many other examples that one can think of. We made a number of recommendations, 5 recommendations. So commissioning of further research, as I've mentioned. Also the mapping of data currently being collected at national and international levels. Who's collecting the data and how is it used? The recognition of interconnectedness and for funding approaches to actually recognize this and to aim at building long-term sustainable systems. And for there to be ongoing campaigns to destigmatize and demedicalize disability and promote a social model, both in countries and in research. And then finally, and perhaps the most importantly, engagement of disabled people in contributing and leading on research, consultancy, and planning processes into a disability inclusive recovery. So now I'm just going to step back and return to the broader programme of work. And as I've mentioned already, we did this initial scoping and workshops with local and regional stakeholders to identify gaps and priorities. And we've commissioned now, network grants have been awarded in the 5 following domains. So we're looking at the creative documentation of the disability social movement in Palestine, creating awareness and challenging stigma through theatre in Palestine, disabled youth in Jordan, disrupting dominant narratives, challenging dominant media constructions and enabling disabled voices in Lebanon, and mainstreaming disability inclusive policies in higher education institutions in Palestine. And our website will, in time, publish more detail about these programs. But that's just to give you a flavour of some of the work. And we've just launched, as I mentioned, larger grants, and we're particularly interested in cross-comparative work. And these are just some of the areas we'd be really interested to, have applications in the areas of. So primary, secondary, and out-of-school children. There's not a lot of research on out-of-school children or non-formal or community education. The nexus of disability, refugees, and war is another area. The gendered dimensions, representations in curriculum, and then looking at the sort of broad area of conceptions and discourses of disability, from decolonising approaches to looking at international measurements or local measurements with a critical lens, looking at media and social media representations, critical policy analyses and legal analyses, narrative, visual arts, and performative performance representations. And also what's really important to us is building infrastructure in the region. You know, this is a project that's only got funding for 4 years, so one has to think of the longevity. And the other area is around research training for early career researchers, disability activists, and disability-led organisations. Now, I'm just going to say a few words about the theoretical underpinnings of the programme. And I've just put up these 2 quotes that capture it quite nicely. The first one is, to start with disability, but never end with it. Disability is the space from which to think through a host of political, theoretical, practical issues that are relevant to all. And then the second one is, disability is inherently colonial, given that it is not fundamentally a question of medicine or health, but of politics and power. So just to explain that a little bit, as I mentioned in the introduction, we have 1 billion people globally with disability. And this is skewed when it comes to the global south, possibly 80%, up to 80% of people with disabilities globally are in the global south. And that number is going to increase up to a quarter of the population, again skewed to the global south. So these thought-provoking statistics challenge dominant ableist assumptions upon which humanness and citizenship are predicated. The second aspect is the decolonisation of disability. This highlights how the production of disability in the global south has been used to exclude others from humanness and citizenship. And we can't understand this without thinking about it historically. It's often rooted in colonialism, and it's not just in the past, it's today too. And these are forms of what we might call neo-colonial power. It can be through war, economic resources, migration, global pollution. Now, if we look to political theory and theories of justice, cognitive capacity is invoked in defining the boundaries of what it is to be a human and therefore a citizen. If we look sociologically, though, the exclusion goes much wider to other types of disabilities, which can be physical, sensory, and so on. And the term marginal, excuse me, the term marginal citizen, the term marginal citizen has been coined to mean a second tier level of citizenship. The sociologist Nash had coined this term to talk about those excluded by, in terms of economically, or by race, religion, ethnicity, but also equally, one can think of the disabled as being within this so-called marginal citizen category. Now, the reason why I'm just mentioning this is if we look at political theory, it's worth noting that the lack of rights for women and non-white populations were based on their presumed lack of rationality and cognitive capacity. And feminists and anti-racist responses argued, no, this is not the case, we're not irrational, you know, we do have cognitive capacity. But that actually leaves untouched that disabled citizens cannot fully participate as citizens. It in effect reifies or supports a medical model of disability as opposed to a social model that says disability is located in the disabling barriers of the lived environment. I mean, if we look historically, those who have deviated from the norm have been pathologized, criminalized, and dehumanized. Darwinian evolutionary theory saw those with intellectual disabilities as being halfway between humans and primates. And it's not only a historical phenomenon, but it can be seen more recently now in legal and medical discourses. If we look at eugenics movements, for example, in the 20th century in the UK and the US, these movements created a subclass of raced and disabled others. If we look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, we see homosexuality was a mental disorder until 1973. So critical disability studies has argued for placing the analysis of disability at the center of understanding empire and colonialism, given that 3/4 of the world disabled people are living in the global south. In addition, there's a strong correlation between disability and poverty. However, the study of disability is predominantly of disability in the global north, or global north scholars studying the global south. So one could say this is a post-colonial form of empire in which knowledge is imposed on or appropriated in different contexts as what's called a technology of imperial biopower. We see ableist constructions of citizenship are exemplified in the long history of immigration to the United States. And immigration was also restricted based on a racially determined hierarchy of immigrants. At this time, eugenics was informed quite a wide range of policies, notably immigration, but also in reproductive policies. So there were forced sterilizations of those considered unfit to reproduce due to poverty, disability, or mental health. In the US, there were such sterilization programs for, quote, mentally feeble women and those in prisons until the 1970s. Eugenics rationalized privilege and the discourse of meritocracy. Now, in the UK, both race and class were central to the British eugenics movement. It's noted that it was championed by an upper middle class of intellectually elite doctors, scientists, and lawyers who were mainly concerned with the problem of the urban poor. The 1913 Mental Deficiency Act gave the power to institutionalize the feeble-minded. The feeble-minded, again, it's this broad category: poor, women on benefits, pregnant women, unmarried women. And these are called negative eugenics methods. And so we think, oh, eugenics has gone away, but it hasn't. It's been replaced by what we would call positive eugenics methods. So, for example, prenatal genetic screening, screening requirements for sperm and egg donors, for example. And so there's a marketplace based on such criteria as intelligence, attractiveness, and health. Now, eugenics principles also underpin rationalizations and operationalizations of empire. Racial inequality was deemed a scientific fact, explained in evolutionary terms. Pearson in 1912 was quoted, "There's no natural equality of human races any more than there's any natural equality of human beings. They're the product of their past evolution, molded by selection and heredity. As far as we can understand it, evolution is largely an irreversible process." So the rise of empire was rationalized in terms of the superiority of the imperialists in racial terms. So now, just to finish up, this research program is just a start. We hope to achieve the following outcomes: improved theoretical understandings of disability in different geographical and sociopolitical contexts, especially in conflict-affected contexts, and to better understand factors impacting access to education, so that researchers can prioritize strategies for short, medium, and longer-term change. And then development of arts and humanities methodologies to enable public education around disability, as well as school-based interventions. And then finally, contextualized understandings of social change to benefit researchers by enabling greater understandings of the links between new knowledge production and how it changes in education policy. Finally, the production of new knowledge emerging from the global south has important potential to challenge the dominance, the hegemony of the global north's production of knowledge on the very nature of what it means to be a human and a citizen. Thank you.
Everybody, is that on? Okay, is it on now? Brilliant, thank you ever so much. Hello, and just for those of you who don't know me, I'm Deborah Udell. I'm the head of the School of Education, and I get the privilege of being the respondent to Dina's paper today. So first of all, just a huge thank you, and it's lovely to do this and it's really great to hear about the work. And I've been involved in the disability embassy sort of from the edges, so it's lovely to see it being shared here today. So there's we've got a bit of a dual pull because it's traditional to have a respondent, but also we know that there are people in the room who, and on Zoom who'd like to talk. So I'm going to try and be brief. Those of you know me knows that's not my first skill in life, being brief. But there's just a couple of things that I really wanted to pull out that I think is really important about Dina's work, and not just this most recent that you've been talking about. Of course, that's what we want to talk about, but the whole body of your work and that journey in relation to understanding the centrality of citizenship and the citizen and the role that education plays in facilitating citizenship, and that then playing through in the current work. So I think it's really important to recognise that thread. And for me, what's important about this work is the way that it really resists the importation of knowledges from the global north and taking them to these countries in the Middle East and presenting them as the solution to problems that we in the global north have diagnosed. And so for me, there's a lovely politics within the project itself, that in the wealthy nation with an Arts and Humanities Research Council that's able to give multi-million pounds to work in this area, what Dina and her team have done is absolutely maximise the amount of that money that they've been able to spend in the three places where the work's taking place. Now, that's really, really important part of the work. And during the first year of the pandemic, when there was some squeeze on the funding, that commitment was redoubled, not pulled back from. So I think that's really important. And so that dual commitment to pushing the money out, but not pushing out the knowledges of the global north. And I think that there is a real challenge, because the critique of a medical model and the understanding of the limitations that medicalisation brings is quite powerful, and yet to find ways of working that are able to share that learning without being corrective or we know better, it's just really important. And I think it's an art, and it's a testament to the collaborative nature of the whole team and the way that you've gone about doing this. So I think that's a really important part of it. And attached to that is the way in which the work is foregrounding facilitation. So it's about offering opportunities to build capacity in those places, understanding context, building the knowledge in context, and building capacity. So as you said, in 4 years when the project's over, the expertise and the careers that have been built are not at the University of Birmingham, they're in those places. So academics at different career levels in the Middle East are benefiting, as are activists, as are people living with disabilities in those places. So I think that those together bring us that possibility of change that you talk about. I mean, we often talk about the change that can come from research. It's sort of compulsory, and yet actually the way that this work's set up, I feel a degree of hopefulness that actually is set up to make real change and facilitate lasting change at a number of levels of society. So I think that I just wanted to pull those things out and say that they're things that that particularly excite me about the work, and I hope that that we'll see the impact of that as these projects come through. I'm sure we will see the impact of that as these projects come through. I want to see if it isn't 7 o'clock, and it is. So I did take the full 5 minutes, and so we aren't going to have time to have questions. It was almost inevitable, wasn't it? So can I ask everybody to thank Dina and join us for refreshments? Thanks, Dina.
Thanks so much.